Hello everyone, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, an ulterior motive, 5th of June 2014. The Abbott government have clearly shown their hand now, and it is clear their intentions are overtly aimed at putting everyday, honest, working Australians back into their historical place. Brett Hoffman, Bridgetown. I include this letter only because I can't actually work out whether it is for or against the current government. I'm not even sure quite what they're referring to in terms of their clear intentions, and whether putting us everyday, honest, hard-working Australians, whether our historical place is a good one or a bad one. I would have thought a good one. I sort of... yeah, on one level it seems like... it's saying that the government, by showing their intention, making their intentions clear, that this is an anti-government piece because, that sounds underhanded. But on the other hand, putting us back in our historical place would surely be elevating us to the podium on which, honest, good, hard-working, white, middle-class, male Australians have always been on. So, there you go. Just goes to show you can write a letter, get it published, and still not actually make it clear what the hell you're trying to say. Pay up front, 6th of June 2014. Fuel companies can stop Bowser thieves by bringing back Bowser attendants, or make all pumps prepay. It's rubbish to say motorists will take custom elsewhere and cause stations to lose trade. Motorists would have no choice. No prepay, no fuel. Frank Cherry, Southlake. Now, I've actually got a bit to say on this because I did work for quite a while in the service station industry. I was in there for probably 5 or 6 years while studying, and I actually have a fairly good understanding about how petrol stations, or service stations, or servos as we tend to call them, work in this state at least. And this argument that... So what's happened is recently there's been some attention to the idea of fuel thieves, fuel thefts from service stations. Essentially somebody fills up and drives off without paying. And this is made possible within where we live here because the standard arrangement is that there are no pump attendants in Western Australia, as far as I know. So about 10 years ago when I worked in a service station, we had pump attendants, we had a couple of pump attendants for our 4 pumps, only on the Saturday morning because the old people in my local area liked it and would pay the extra, basically to cover the cost of it. That's the last time I've seen pump attendants. Basically, they're unheard of because nobody wants to pay for them. And that's basically the bottom line, is people will always go for cheaper fuel even if it means no pump attendants. Even if it means worse service. People are so driven by fuel prices here that all of this argument about convenience, all of this argument about how it would be better to have pump attendants, it's just not economical. Also, given that we value people's labour here, and labour costs are one of the highest costs of doing business here, means that there really is no cheap labour that you can use for Bowser attendants. Even we would employ teenagers, because you can employ teenagers at less than the full adult wage, and even then we were struggling to cover the costs of it. And so, yeah, what this misses is that, one, people don't want to pay for Bowser attendants. And somewhere along the line, somebody has to pay for that extra service. And so, time and time again, it was shown that we would lose business whenever our petrol prices were even slightly higher than the competition. We would lose business. And we needed our petrol prices to be slightly higher in order to cover the cost of Bowser attendants. And the second thing about prepay is, and what is missing entirely in this, is that certainly in our market, there are really only a couple of large fuel companies who do the actual processing of the fuel. Back when I was in the industry, there was only one refinery that was producing refined fuel that was to the standard for a West Australian market. And of that, there were only a couple of major oil companies, essentially, that had arrangements with that refinery. So it really was a bit of a duopoly. There were maybe 2 or 3. And the service stations are not actually owned... Well, the service stations are not operated by the fuel companies. So generally the fuel companies will lease the land and they might own the buildings on it, and then they will rent that to the company which actually runs the service station, that pays the employees, stocks it, decides on that kind of various stuff, and then supplies the fuel. And the fuel is entirely owned by the fuel company. So the fuel company has this arrangement with the person who's running it, which is, back when I was in it, with small businesses. Nowadays it's getting to be larger and larger businesses that are running those. So you have the fuel company that owns the fuel and usually rents the land and owns the buildings. They supply the fuel, which is then sold by the business owner on behalf of the oil company and back when I was in it, there was no margin on fuel, which meant that the business owner, the people who are actually running the service station, made literally no money off the fuel. So every single cent of that went straight back to the oil company. So the business person running it only made money off the sales from in the shop, which is also why there was always a massive markup. The things in the shop usually had about a 200% markup. So whatever the cost price was, we were selling it for double. And that was the way it worked. So the reason why prepay was never a good idea was because it was an interesting psychological phenomenon. We did do some prepay in some of the service stations I worked at where, like at late nights and stuff, we would insist that people pay for their fuel beforehand. They'd come in, tell us how much they want, we'd take the money, we'd then authorise the pump, and they could pump in just only that amount. And invariably what would happen is those people would come in with their mindset on the fuel. They would then prepay the fuel, and after having prepaid the fuel, they would then go out and pump, at which point they were finished and they would leave. And because they were focused on prepaying the fuel when they came in, they would rarely buy anything from the shop. Which meant that customer was worth nothing to us as a business. In fact, was worth negative money because it would take my time away from doing other things. A customer who fills up first comes into the shop generally with a mindset of paying, but also then can get distracted to purchase things. So essentially, the costs of fuel theft, because that's the other arrangement about fuel theft, is that the cost of that stolen fuel is usually borne by the operator, not the fuel company. So the fuel company supplies X number of litres of fuel and then will set the price. Usually they set the price of the fuel, and then they will receive the amount of money of how much fuel we delivered, whether or not it was stolen or sold, which meant that any cost was borne by the business operator. So the business operator had this choice: do we do prepay for everybody, which would then massively cut into any kind of revenue that we had, or do we allow for the occasional fuel theft, which also cuts into revenue? And invariably the balance was that it was better to just suck up the fuel theft as the cost of doing business. Now, whether or not that's fair, I actually don't think it is. I think the large fuel companies have way too much clout, but I think we've lost that battle. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been an incredibly sharp drop in the number of independently owned or small business run service stations, and now it's the big supermarket players like Coles and Woolworths that run almost all of them these days. And I think that's basically done. And this now is just sort of now I guess fuel theft is seen as being the cost of doing business, which it basically is. And usually motorists really didn't like prepay when I was there, and they would invariably prefer to go to non-prepay service stations because it's less convenient. A large number of the customers we had did not know how much fuel they wanted. They just wanted to fill up their tank, and therefore prepaying was inconvenient because you generally don't have I wasn't aware of anything that had the capacity to, say, pre-authorise, except on credit cards, which most people weren't paying with, to pre-authorise, say, an FPOS transaction for $100, allow them to pump the gas, take only the amount of petrol, like the cost that they used, and refund the amount. It wasn't possible. And so invariably we had to tell people we couldn't allow them to just fill up. They would have to nominate an amount. And then you get trouble with what happens if they try and pump in, they say, oh, well, I'll take $60, and they pump in $55, they can't take any more. You then have to come and do refunds and things. So prepay was actually a really unpopular thing to do. And so Frank Cherry of Southlake, that is not the panacea that you think it would be for the service station industry. And in fact, I'm glad I'm out of it because I think as an industry, it's basically just been taken over by large multinational corporations now, and is largely out of the hands of anybody who actually cares. Size does matter, 7th of June 2014. I strongly believe that young people with P plates should not be allowed to drive a car with an engine capacity of more than 1.6 litres. In the case of the driver who launched a Ford GTP onto a Holden Astra in Craigie, he, and not the insurer, should be made to pay for the vehicle he damaged. Jack Palmer, Albany. Okay, so a couple of things here. Firstly, if there was anything illegal or dangerous about the way the person was driving, it's actually quite likely that the insurance company will refuse to cover it. So there are standard exclusions in almost all, or as far as I know, all car insurance policies, which say that if you're driving in a manner that is against the law, that's not lawful, the insurance company won't cover you. So if he was driving sufficiently dangerous that it was illegal, then he won't be covered by the insurance. If he was driving in a manner that wasn't sufficiently dangerous to be illegal, but just happened to have an accident that was fairly spectacular, he managed to park his car on top of another one, then I think it's entirely fair that the insurance company covers it. The second thing, or the first thing in your letter about P-platers. So for those who aren't familiar, here in Australia, Western Australia in particular, when you first receive your driver's license, you are provisionally licensed to drive. And so the first 2 to 3 years, I think it's 3 years now, you have to have P plates up on your car, sort of like a learner's plate with an L, but it's with a P, to identify you as a new driver. And there's a range of restrictions on P platers that don't apply to the rest of us. You have much stricter requirements on your amount of alcohol you can have in your system while driving. And I think even for the first year or so, there may even be curfews on the driving. I'm not sure. Maybe they're talking about or limits to the number of passengers you can have, although I'm not sure if they brought that in or not. Point is, we already have restrictions on P-platers, and so the letter is advocating that we should have another restriction. I don't think engine capacity is a particularly good measure, but I do think it's not such a bad idea, the spirit of it, which is that, there should be a restriction on the total power of the vehicle for P-platers, say, so that P-platers wouldn't be allowed to have a vehicle with more than a certain amount of power. Say 90 kilowatts of peak power or 100 kilowatts of peak power or something like that. But first, I would like to know whether this is actually going to be helpful. So we know that P-platers and young drivers are overrepresented in crash statistics. So new drivers and young drivers, although not all new drivers are young drivers. So I'm not sure whether there's good research to separate the effect of being a new driver from being a young driver, but we know that both of those groups tend to be P-platers and are overrepresented in crash statistics. And if we could establish that there is actually a causal connection between the power of your vehicle and your likelihood of having a crash, then I think, yeah, it'd be perfectly reasonable to say, while you're inexperienced, first 2 to 3 years of having your license, we will restrict the amount of power that you can have in a vehicle that you're driving. No worries, I've got no problems with that. But there is another complicating factor. It would be hard, I actually think it might be quite hard to establish that this is causal, partly because I think even if you established it was correlational, i.e. that P-platers with more powerful cars crashed more than P-platers with less powerful cars, there is another factor there that it's not necessarily causative, because rev-head hoons, people who have a mentality of wanting to drive dangerously, say, are more likely to want powerful cars. And that if you restrict the power of the cars that they can have, I suspect that these people would still drive dangerously. And so you would need to do more work than simply show that people who drive powerful cars tend to crash more. Because I suspect that there is another factor there, that is that people who like to drive dangerously also like to have powerful cars. But overall, not a bad idea. Jack Palmer of Albany. Teachers fret. 7th of June, 2014. A student at a private school complains that she has her individuality impeded because she is harassed by staff to remove her nail polish, bracelets and earrings. Girls want to have fun 5th of the 6th. Sorry, darling, but you go to school to learn and prepare yourself for future employment, not to express your need to be yourself. That you can do at home, in your own time, or in the shopping mall, after school time, where you possibly go to discuss your individuality with your friends of a similar ilk. Trish Harmer, Southern River. Okay, so a little bit of backstory. So the original letter was by a private school girl who was writing in to complain, essentially, that one of the clear messages that the school was trying to tell them was that that they would be judged based on their education and their sort of academic achievements, but at the same time, the school was placing a fair bit of emphasis on their appearance, and was even taking up class time doing inspections of the girls' appearance, and not just gross things about whether or not they were wearing the uniform, but actually quite subtle things like amount of nail polish they were wearing, bracelets and earrings. And she basically wrote in to say, look, aren't we here to learn? Why waste this time when all we're doing is expressing a little bit of individuality? Isn't it more important that we should learn? Of course, the newspaper, for one, titled the letter "Girls Want to Have Fun," which wasn't the point she was making at all. She wasn't saying that she should be allowed to have fun. She was actually saying that why aren't we spending more, like, oh, aren't we focusing on our education? Isn't that the thing that's supposed to be important? Also, if you want to send us the message that as girls it's how well we do in school and things that actually is important, then why are you spending so much time caring about our appearance? Shouldn't we be told that, shouldn't you be consistent in your message that appearances aren't everything? And of course, these letters that people responded to were ultimately, a lot of them were condescending, basically told to suck it up, and one of them went even so far as to sort of basically say that, oh look, it's fine that the school is caring very much about how you comport yourself, because that sends the, you represent the school, which essentially implicitly accepted that people in the wider society would judge the value of the school by its the appearance of its students. That is, that their appearance is important, which I think is appalling. I think this girl had an incredibly valuable point, that if education is important, that's what you should spend your time doing at school, and that a bit of individuality around the corners, around the edges of your uniform wearing, really shouldn't be that significant. Especially things like nail polish, bracelets and earrings. I mean, these are trivialities. They hardly, as she put it, they hardly impede her ability to learn, or anybody else's ability to learn. Whether somebody's wearing earrings or not doesn't stop them from learning. And so for the school to waste their time on it, it seemed like a dodgy decision. And the fact that all of the responses from men and women alike were basically to try and put this girl in her place, I think shows how little respect we show to teenagers in general, and to women teenagers in particular. Giving the voice to the invisible among us, 10th of June 2014. We are homeless, we can't find work, and we sleep in cars, parks, tents or backyards. We have no showers, and if our kids go to school, they are hungry. We all line up for food daily and thank God for the salvos. Did we come by boat? No. We are the 200,000 Australians living in poverty. We are invisible. Had we come by boat, this wouldn't be allowed. Gwen Moppet, Doubleview. Okay, so actually you get a few things wrong here. First of all, there are actually about 2 million Australians living in poverty, depending on how you define poverty. So the standard sort of measure that is used, it seems to be used, is that if your household income is half of the Australian median household income, so if you're earning essentially half of the average income, for some definition of average, that would be at about poverty. That might actually, half of about the median income, so the halfway mark, sounds like a fair bit to me, but when I looked at the figures, it's actually less than the government welfare for a single person. So government welfare for a single person is about 500, it's just slightly more than. So government welfare for a single person is about 500 a fortnight, and the poverty line, such as it is, was being drawn at about 600 or 700 a fortnight. So yeah, if your household income is about $700 a fortnight or less, then you are defined as being in poverty, and there's about 2 million people like that. Now, this isn't the poverty of the third world, this is not starving Ethiopian children or things like that, but this is people who are chronically unable to provide for essentially what we would consider the basics of life in our Western democracy. So these are people who struggle to provide shelter, food, clothing, education, for everybody in their household. And that's 2 million people. That is roughly been estimated to about, somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 12, which is an incredibly large number of people for a country like ours. And I was actually shocked by that. I actually think that's an indictment. Now, when I looked at the geographical distribution, it made a lot more sense. Essentially, we're looking at almost the entirety of the Northern Territory, or rural areas across Queensland, New South Wales, and all of the desert areas across Western Australia. So essentially, we're looking at the remote and regional and predominantly Aboriginal people, which is frightening. It's frightening that it's that much. Now, the interesting thing is, you talk about people being homeless who's living in cars, parks, tents, and backyards. Now, that's interesting. So that 2 million people is what we would call poverty. Now, there are only 100,000 homeless people in Australia. So that's only 1 in 20 people in poverty are actually homeless. which is far less. And I thought, oh, okay, that's pretty good. But actually, that's even surprising. We're actually surprisingly good at homeless. So, of those 100,000 homeless people, the vast majority of those people are not what you would classically think of as homeless. So the vast majority, 94% of those people, live in a house. It's not their house. It's not necessarily a house they have rights to. It may be an overcrowded house. It's often somebody else's house who is temporarily putting it up. But of that 100,000, only 6,000 people in the entirety of Australia are actually sleeping rough in improvised shelters. So your classic case of sort of thinking about a homeless person of sleeping in doorways, in alleys, under bridges and stuff, that is only 6,000 people for the entirety of Australia, right? And the vast majority of these people are Aboriginal people living in the Northern Territory, Northern Western Australia and Queensland. And so if you think about urbanised, homeless, poor people, there's a tiny number of them. There really is a tiny number of them, which is good, and that is a success. Now, I think we need to do something about poverty, but the fact that we are doing very well at homelessness is fantastic news. Now, you compare it to the idea of illegal immigrants coming here by boat, and the idea that people who come here by boat are getting treated better than those Australians who live in poverty. Now, the interesting thing is, you have 6,000 people Australia-wide who are sleeping rough. We have 3,700 people in immigration detention because they arrived here by boat. That means that actually on sheer numbers, and in fact it's been as high as 12,000 in the last several years. So in fact, it's been somewhere, at the moment it's more than half the number of people sleeping rough. We have almost half that number in detention. And in the last several years, we've had twice as many of those people banged up. So actually, the surprising thing is that we have actually done a very good job for Australian homeless people. There's more to be done, certainly in particular areas of the country. But for the vast majority of people who are poor in Australia, we have actually put a roof over their head. And the other thing is about people coming here is that there is a moral. Now, I need to be careful. I do believe that the government is responsible for ensuring that everybody in Australia has a roof over their head and has reasonable living standards. I believe that is essentially, that is the responsibility of in all of us in society, and necessarily government as a result, government as our representatives. But I think that you have an extra responsibility to people who you detain involuntarily. So there is a difference between a free person on the street who the government does not control their actions, right? And that person theoretically is free to make all sorts of decisions. And I think it is up to the government to give them the opportunity to have a roof over their head, to have the opportunity to work, to have healthcare, etc., etc. But it's more about providing opportunities. On the other hand, if we lock that person up for a crime that they've committed, we are taking on, as a society, as a government, we have full responsibility for ensuring their standards of living. And we are absolutely then responsible for them. And it's the same with immigration detention. When somebody comes here and seeks asylum and we decide we're going to lock them up, in that act of saying that, yes, we will lock you up and deny you your freedom, we are taking on complete responsibility for that person. We are saying, absolutely, they are our responsibility. And yes, we should be providing, at a basic minimum, roof over their head, healthcare, education, food. All of these things should be required because that is a bare minimum living standards. And to say that on one hand, because that's the other thing, to say on one hand, yes, look at all these people who come here by boat, we provide them with all of this, but what about the poor Australians? Well, I think you would find most people who are advocating for good treatment of asylum seekers and refugees would also advocate for the good treatment of poor people and Aboriginals in our community. It's generally those people who don't care about the refugees who also don't care about poor Aboriginal people. It's hardly that we care about one and not the other. Anyway, that's it for this week. It's been an interesting week. It's been some good letters. I even had a letter published in a newspaper, and they butchered it beyond almost all recognition. So never again will I criticise people who've written in for the poor grammar or incoherence of the editing of their letters. Because if it can happen to me, it can happen to them. Anyway, that's it for this week. I've had a good week. I hope you've had a good week. Join me next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.